This is what, like, punch a Nazi. Who's a Nazi? Everybody that doesn't agree with you. I mean, it's essentially what's being said ad nauseum in social justice warrior circles online. And you see, I've seen punch a Nazi so many times. I mean, but when it came down to Charlottesville, there was very little punching of Nazis. You know, the whole thing was like, it's all very insane. When you see real Nazis, like, those are real Nazis. You know, like, go fucking punch them, please. You know,
well, we've also, I think,
and don't even do that, by the way.
Right. Well, and I think we've already figured out, everyone, right from the right to the left, everyone's figured out that wherever the Nazis went, that was wrong. We've all agreed on that. We're not going there anymore. And so when someone pops up and says, well, we should go there, it's like, they're immediately identifiable. You can box them in, and if you have any sense, like, you know, like many conservatives did in the aftermath of Charlottesville, they come out and say, well, in case it needs to be said again, we're actually not allied with those people.
Yeah, well, that's that was the most disturbing thing for many people about Donald Trump's reaction to it, that he didn't take a hard stance against these white supremacists showing up with tiki torches, walking through the street, yelling anti-Semitic phrases or whatever. I don't know exactly what they're yelling. I've read a bunch of different things, but the whole thing was it was an abomination. I mean, it was a horrific thing to watch. And, you know, Donald Trump comes out and says there was horrible behavior on all sides.
I think we underrate the danger of, and I think Nazis are a red herring. There is something that actually does threaten to reemerge, and Charlottesville is a version of it. But I think because we have a cartoon understanding of what that protest was actually about and how many people are actually involved, we don't really see why this is a dangerous and contentious issue. And I think the answer is an evolutionary one that hasn't been spelled out. And because it hasn't been spelled out, it's very hard to point to.
I hate to keep interrupting you, but just get this right up to your face, because it sounds good to us, but the people listening online are going to have an issue.
Is that better?
Yeah, just when you turn to him, just turn the thing with you.
Okay.
Yeah, just get it. Always keep it a fist from your face. That's the best. Sorry.
That's all right.
So explain what you mean by this.
So my point would be that what took place in Germany in the 30s was a particularly visible, well-documented example of a pattern that is much more common in human history. And because this pattern emerges as a result of certain features of the way evolution functions in the context of humans, it is actually always a danger that it will reemerge. And knowing what to do about it is not so simple until you've seen why it occurs and what it means. What I've been saying in lectures I've given on this is that tyranny is the end game of prosperity. And so there is a pattern in which you will go through a period of prosperousness in which it appears that that thing is defeated once and for all, and there's no reason for people to be going after each other in this particular way. And then at the point that that pattern peters out, it reemerges and people don't expect it. It flies under a different flag or something like that. And so I do think that looking at the tiny number of people who were doing what they were doing in Charlottesville and saying, well, we all agree that this is wrong, misses the fact that actually, I think Trump is doing it cynically, but Trump was riding a wave, that there are ideas which are not permissible from the environments in which we all grew up that are going to become permissible again if we are not careful to recognize that that's the nature of history.
I think it's highly probable that that's going to occur. I mean, part of the reason that I landed in the political hot water that I landed in last year was because I was increasingly aware that this process of polarization was going to take place, and that the continual, in my estimation anyways, the continual clawing of new ground underneath the radical leftist rubric, especially in the universities, is starting to produce an extraordinarily dangerous counterposition. And that was manifest, at least to some degree, in Charlottesville. And so I think you're right, is that, well, you don't want to be complacent and say, well, we know who the Nazis are and we're not going there, and so the problem is solved. The problem isn't solved. There's all sorts of weird activity in the non-radical left space, like on the other side of the radical left, whatever that is. And right now, what it is not obvious. You know, it's the alt-right, that's part of it. It's the Kekistanis, it's this peppy thing. some of it's comedy, some of it's satire, some of it's serious, some of it's the inversion of identity politics, which is very dangerous. And it's maybe the most dangerous thing about Charlottesville is that there's something extraordinarily dangerous about having people revert to identification with their racial identity. It's really not a good thing.
Well, there's the reversion to their racial identity. There's basically an outbreak of tribalism, which explains what's going on the far right. What's going on the left is a bit of a new twist. What you have is a coalition of different tribal identities that aren't large enough to marshal a force on their own, and so they're united, and together they are a formidable force. But what's going to happen is that's an unstable entity. At the point that that force gains power, it's going to come apart as internal dynamics rip it up. So it's not actually it's not capable of restraining the version that recurs on the right, the version that does manifest as white nationalism. That version is stable because it does represent an actual population that has an evolutionary basis for remaining cohesive. And I should point out, there's a danger when you hear an evolutionary biologist talk about evolutionary patterns. People often infer that if an evolutionary biologist is saying that something is a pattern that has evolved, that that's some kind of a defense, and it is absolutely not. We call this the naturalistic fallacy. Mm-hmm. So evolution is an absolutely amoral process. It has produced the most marvelous features of human beings and the worst features, and we are in some sense obligated to pick and choose which features to honor and promote and which ones to tamp down.
Something can have evolved as a virtue in some circumstances and still be of the type that, if magnified beyond its proper limits, becomes pathological.
I want to point out that, at least in the West and probably universally, human beings, when they go to war, tend to dehumanize the other population. And, so, of course, calling the other population subhuman, vermin, whatever it is that human beings do. And my concern is that we are doing exactly this with the Nazis or de facto Nazis who are showing up on our screens at this point. That what we are doing is we are comforting ourselves by saying, well, that's a small outbreak of something that makes these people subhuman, justifies punching them or whatever. And I'm not squeamish about there being a right to violence when somebody is threatening a way of life. So it's not that. But my concern is that if you take the pathogen model and you imagine that all those folks who showed up in Charlottesville, that is a contagion and it needs to be isolated, then you will have the sense that as long as you do that, it's not going to show up somewhere else. Whereas what's, I think, the actual hazard is that that's actually a latent program that has served populations in past circumstances. It's indefensible, but it has served populations, and the populations that we come from have it, therefore, on reserve. And when certain characteristics show up in the environment, that program can emerge. And so my concern is that that's where we are in history.
Right. It can't be isolated as a phenomena that's associated with the other.
Right.
I mean, one of the things I've done for decades is teach my students a variant of that, which is something like, because I try to walk them through psychological understanding of what happened in Nazi Germany and in the more intense situations like in places like in Auschwitz. So the question might be, well, if you were in Germany in the 1930s, could you be a concentration camp guard? And the gut reaction to that is, no, those people are unlike me. And that's the wrong response. The right response is, those people were human and I'm also human. And so that means that the Nazi is us. That's what it means. And so, and who the hell wants to think that? And no one will think that. And I have thought that through, because I thought through, for a variety of reasons, what the limits of my potential behavior are. And the limits of my potential, and maybe I'm more pathological than the average person, it's certainly possible, but I understand that the limits of my potential behavior are far beyond the bounds of what people would normally consider civilized. And I think that's characteristic of human beings in general.
Well, so, I mean, looking... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think this is one of the things that really highlights the importance of having uncensored discussions, because we've already hit on so many hot topics to the point where you have to really clarify your position, and when you're talking about this sort of latent program in human beings and the necessity for it at one point in time, all these things are very taboo to discuss today. And this is a giant issue because what you guys are doing is talking about things objectively, reasonably, logically, and clearly. But when you get to these sort of hysterical subjects, that's sort of forbidden today. And there's a giant issue with that because when you have forbidden discussions, you energize those topics. And the topics grow in the absence of discussion, in the absence of being picked apart and analyzing them for what their core components are. And when we're talking about it from an evolutionary perspective, this is very, very important because these patterns are reemerging. We do see that. And I think any one of us, given the wrong neighborhood, the wrong parents, the wrong life, we might have been one of those assholes with the tiki torches in Charlotte. I mean, we're human beings, like you said. I think that is absolutely critical to discuss.
Well, and it's also, there's another thing going on right now. I've been trying to characterize the state of the sociological and psychological landscape that we all inhabit right now. And I think we're in a position of radical instability. And things in the future could be way better than they are right now, radically, and they could be way worse than they are. And the small decisions that people make are going to have outsized effects while they make them. Like, look at what happened with this guy in Charlottesville. You know, I know he was surrounded by a coterie of deplorables, let's say, but it was one guy who decided to do something murderous. And that shifted the whole political landscape. And so what I see happening right now is that we're surrounded by these interactions between people that are positive feedback loops, you know, and a positive feedback loop occurs when if you do something, then it makes whatever caused that occur even in a greater way. And the polarization is like that. So I say something left-like and you say something right-like, and that annoys me, so I get more left, and it annoys you and you get more right, and all of a sudden we're at each other's throats. And that's happening everywhere, right? It's very unstable. And what's to be hoped for is that we can pull back from that and discuss it. We can say, look, you know, under circumstance A, I could have been a communist inquisitor or a Nazi prison guard. I need to know that. And then I need to know what were the situations that made that likely. And then I need to know how should I conduct myself so that's less possible. And the only way we can figure that out is to have the kind of conversations that we're having right now.
I think one of the white nationalist papers had a breakdown of what Trump did, and that essentially at the end they were saying he didn't go after us, he didn't target us, this was very good. He was very clear that it was all sides and that he never once targeted us, he didn't say anything bad about us. See, and then they said, God bless Trump at the end of it.
There's a real tricky issue there about truth, you know, because my free speech, the free speech panel that I was a part of was canceled. I had to make comments in the Canadian media about Charlottesville. And so I really had to think about what Trump said, because the fact that there is reprehensible behavior on both sides of the extremes of the distribution is true. However, truth is a tricky thing because you have to take the temporal context into account. You know, because I would say you can imagine that there are white lies and black truths. A black truth is when you use the truth in a way that isn't truthful, just like a white lie is when you use when you lie in a way that isn't harmful. You can use the truth to wound and hurt, and what that really means is that you've misused the truth, and so it's actually a complex form of lie. But what Trump did wrong, this is independent of whether or not he was actually engaging in manipulation or deceit, was he failed to specify the time and the place for the utterance, because what he should have come out and done was said, I unequivocally denounce the white supremacist racism that emerged in Charlottesville.
Yes.
And then he should have shut up. And then 2 weeks later, he could have said, well, when we look at the political landscape as a whole, perhaps commenting on Berkeley, he could have said, it's pretty obvious that there are reprehensible individuals acting out at both ends of the extreme. But the Charlottesville week wasn't the week to make that point. So, and you know, why he did that? Well, it could be just ineptness, because it was a very tricky week to exactly get things right.
I don't think so. I think actually we can look at the what he did during the election, and I think we should expect that he would do exactly what he did.
Well, fair enough. I think there's
a wink and a nod to them always. What is neo-Nazis and white supremacists applaud Donald Trump's response? Yeah. See if you could see the actual. Does it show the actual text of what they wrote? Because
quote from the editor here, right there.
He refused to even mention anything to do with us. Reporters were screaming at him in the white nationalism. He just walked out of the room. Huh.
Right.
There was an actual article that they wrote on one of those websites. Trump's comments were good. He didn't attack. That's it. He didn't attack us. Just said the nation should come together. Nothing specific against us. He said that we need to study why people get so angry and implied that there was hate. ... on both sides! ! So he implied that the Antifa are haters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so that energized them in a way. And I mean, there's no secret that they support him. You know, my friend Alonzo Bowden has a very funny quote. He's a comedian. He goes, "Not all Trump supporters are racist, but all racists are Trump supporters."
Right.
I mean, it's a great quote.